Hello, everyone. Welcome to part two of a six-part series on colorism in the workplace. I am joined with Dr. Shannon Anderson here to talk about colorism in education. And now, a lot of us might think of education as being one of the pipelines to the workplace, but we also have to think about schools as being workplaces themselves. And so before we jump in, y'all know how I like to do my lives. I like to see who's tuning in into the chat. I like interactive lives. So if you're here, if you can see us, if you can hear us, be sure to say hello. Let us know where you're watching from. And yeah, we're going to get started in just a second. Let me open up the chat so I can make sure I see y'all. So as we begin, I'd like to introduce you all to Dr. Anderson. I've known her for a while now, and I think she's been doing phenomenal work. And I'm excited to have someone who not only understands colorism, but also understands the world of education specifically to join me here this week. So Dr. Anderson, please tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, what you do.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Webb. It's so nice to be able to see you again. I have been in education since about 1996 in different capacities. I started out as an elementary school teacher. Then I quickly went into administration after about 5 or 6 years, and I ran an alternative school for 6th through 12th graders. I ran the Saturday school program for the school system. And then I also was an administrator at an elementary school as well. And so then I went over into charter school world and then opened up in an existing organization 2 sites at a charter school in Southeast DC. And then I went back to public school and came into the school system I'm in now. So I've had experience working mostly in Title I schools, K through 12, and right now I work in the central office in the school system. I've worked with family engagement, and right now I'm working with equity and student conduct. So I've been 25 years in education, different capacities, working with the little ones from 3 years old all the way up to 12, and now supporting the schools.
Awesome. What a wealth of experience you have. And just so for folks who don't know the educational lingo, what are Title I schools?
Oh, okay. So Title I schools are schools. I see you're trying to get me here. So Title I schools are schools who are identified by need, right? And so they're from socioeconomics. Basically, that's the kind of the criteria is the socioeconomic need. So, and then what happens is funding comes from into the schools, additional funding to support positions, might support extracurriculum and things like that for that group.
Gotcha. Yeah, so it's a designation based on socioeconomic need that a school has. All right. Thank you for that great introduction. And right on time, because we have folks in the chat starting to say hello. We have a LinkedIn user from Salt Lake City. Welcome, Salt Lake City. We have Salita from cold Atlanta. You have to add the adjective that is cold in Atlanta. I've been joking all day that it's feeling quite warm up here in NYC, so safe spaces. And then we have Elizabeth. Thank you for joining, Elizabeth, as always, from Tennessee. Welcome. So we have a good little variety of folks. And if you're just tuning in, we do welcome questions and comments along the way. If you have them, this is part 2 in a 6-part series on colorism in the workplace. And so, we have Dr. Anderson here who has 25 years of experience in education. But what sparked your interest in the aspect of colorism?
Well, when I was working on my doctorate, I went through lots of different ideas of what interested me, and I knew that it was going to be something that was near and dear to my heart, whether it was disproportionality of discipline or overrepresentation of students in special education programs, and then and I wanted to focus on the area of equity, right? And so I'm not even sure how colorism came into mind, but really, when you're thinking about the research you want to do, you have to think about something that you don't mind talking about all the time, something that you're passionate about, and something that you might have some experience with, right? And so, um, growing up as the only female and the darkest child in the family, there was a lot of things that went on, not within my family, but more so like comments about from neighbors or comments from out people outside of my immediate family, right? That really compared my brothers and I, my mom and I, and things like that. And so, and I knew how, with my experience in education, that children, were my students were having issues with this as well. And you could see it from the peer to peer relationships. You can hear comments other educators would say. So you really see this, right? And so every time I second guessed myself or thought, maybe this research doesn't have legs, there was always something that brought me back to it, right? Whether it was a commercial, whether it was a comment from a coworker that I work with now, there was always something saying, Shannon, this is important research. You need to power through and do it, right? And so you'll get those messages a lot, and I was like, this has legs. Let me go ahead and continue with this research.
Yes, I can definitely relate to that in terms of when I was deciding on actually, I knew my dissertation topic before going into grad school because I started colorism healing, and that's why I went back for my PhD. But it's the same thing. Like, I had experience, I was passionate about it, and I knew I could talk about it every day. So yeah, I definitely relate to that. And then it's interesting too, because I remember talking to I think it was a college freshman. They wanted to write their paper on colorism, and their professor kept discouraging them, saying, well, maybe you should just talk about racism instead, So I definitely think that sometimes people can say, well, why are you talking about this? Like, is this really as important as you think it is, or as you say it is? Or, like I said, does this research actually have legs? Like, can you actually does it have the scope that you need? One, I'm glad that you stuck with it. And I'm glad that researchers who are concurrent with us and that have come before us and that are coming after us choose this topic and continue to choose this topic. So I don't know who's watching live, but if you have questions along the way, feel free to drop them in the chat or comments. We're looking specifically at colorism in education as part of the series on colorism and the workplace. But in keeping with that conversation about research, tell us kind of what your research was. What did you do in your research process, and what was that process like for you?
Well, what I decided to do was interview women and ground them back into their experience, their K through 12 experience, right? And so I did that for a couple of reasons. Like, really, I really wanted to see what, like, the students, the young kids were thinking about it now. But there's so much red tape that you have to go through the research. So what I decided to do was and I didn't want to traumatize kids, a lot. So what I wanted to do is, what I decided to do was interview adult women, and ground them back into their educational experience and talk about their experiences with colorism, right? And so, so there are specific areas I wanted to talk about. We talked about family. So in my research, there's what I call the sphere of influences, right? These are these external influences that impact a person. And so those external influences are your family, right? And a lot of times family are the first person or first group of people that you um, um, or experience these colorist ideologies from, right? Then I have your society, media, education, which is school, and also did I say media, education, school, and peer groups, your peers, right? So when you think about, so those are all your external influences, right? So you're in the middle. So you have all these external influences coming at you. And then there's the way you respond to them. And you can respond to them by having like low self-esteem. Maybe you don't feel like that you are worthy of that you're not smart or intelligent. You're not worthy of going further in education. You might have problems with relationships and things like that. So when so in my research, I wanted to talk to women to see what were those experiences like during that time period, right? And really going further than that, like, are they still experiencing this as a 21-year-old? And as my oldest participant was 44, no, 54. I'm sorry, 54. And many of them were still experiencing this kind of the similar things as a 54-year-old than as they were when they were 7, different ways, right?
Yeah.
So it's definitely saying that it's colorism is still there and people were still being impacted by it. And so that's really how I started the research and the women that I wanted to study. Now, I didn't put in a criteria for skin color, so the skin color kind of ranged.
Yeah.
Okay, the skin color kind of ranged. So I did have everybody use the skin color scale to kind of talk about um, what range, how they identified their skin color. But I did end up, even though there were many women from really different races or ethnicities, I only selected the ones for the research that identified as African American or Black.
Gotcha. Yes. So what were some of the major themes that came up?
That came out of that? Okay. So within those themes, there were many things that came out of it. So there were the women. A lot of them said they experienced colorism with their families. Again, like I said, and so from the families, they were kind of were the people they were that introduced them to colorism, right? And then the schools, the school system and their experience within it kept perpetuating a lot of those same things, right? And so I say that the schools are microcosms of our society, right? So what's going on outside the school is definitely going on inside the school, right? And so if adults in the building have these perceptions of what is beautiful, who is smart, who is approachable, who is well behaved or not, that's going to carry on in the school. And that's why our students experience those things, right? So they didn't only experience from peer to peer, they also experience for the interactions they have with the adults in the building. That's why that you'll know if research has been done about like suspension rates, right? And if you look at the skin tones of students who were suspended, the ones with the darker skin, even though they might have the same infraction as a lighter skinned Black child, will get a harsher punishment in the schools for a longer suspension or expulsion, right? And so that research has already said that. And so although none of my participants were suspended, they noticed that there was a difference in how they were treated in the classroom. And so some of them said, they knew they were smart, right? But the teacher wouldn't call on them, right? Or they felt like because of the way they looked, people automatically thought they were the ones that did something. The troublemakers, right? The troublemakers because of the way they looked. So there are those two aspects of it. There's also the peer interactions as far as friendships and cliques that happen. There's a love interest, conflict that happen, right? And then there is that the perception that they aren't intelligent as well. So those are the intelligence and the threat that kind of assigned to different attributes, right? And
Yeah.
so colorism is not just saying, I think this person's beautiful or not, right? It's the assignment of these,
Oh.
it's the assignment of these characteristics or these behaviors that negatively impact or positively impact a person.
Come on, say it.
Their skin color, their hair texture, their phenotype,
Yes.
all that stuff all takes place. So people like, oh, they try to reduce it down to dating,
Yeah.
right? Or,
Right.
she's bad about this or whatever. We can't reduce it down that because it can be very, it's problematic, especially when it comes to who's considered a threat in your building, your school building, or when you walk out that building by the police, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so there's
Mm-hmm.
definitely research that supports that students who have more Negroidian features, you know,
Mm-hmm.
have been have been disproportionately suspended
Yeah.
or placed in special education programs more so. And there's less engagement with families just because of that because of colorism and colorist ideologies.
Yes.
Um,
You gave us a lot.
so
So you can pause because I see you can pause. What you just laid out
mhm,
for the folks watching is deep. And I know some folks gonna need a minute to process that anyway, because like you said, so
mhm.
many people think colorism is just who was the cute girl in class.
Right, right.
And they get woken up to the fact that all the ways that racism creates inequality, colorism is also creating inequalities,
Mhm,
right? So when we look at most people would say, oh, it's unfair that a African American child gets suspended
mhm,
more harshly or more often than a white child who commits the same act.
mhm, mhm.
So, the racial disparities between races, people are very familiar and comfortable with those conversations.
Right.
And people are a lot less familiar and a lot less comfortable
Mhm,
acknowledging and recognizing the ways that even amongst students of the same racial group, they're not being treated the same. There's
mhm,
inequality, there's disparity. And
mhm,
the one study you talked about in particular is one that I always repeat to myself or repeat when I'm talking about it because it was so shocking to me. And it may not be the exact same study, but
mhm.
I just remember reading the findings of one particular study that talked about for African American girls with the darkest skin tones were 3 times
3
more
times.
likely to be
Mhm.
suspended than girls with very light skin tones.
Thank you.
We're not talking about inconsequential differences. We're talking
Mhm,
about deep chasms
mhm,
in
mhm.
outcomes. And there are
Absolutely.
studies even outside of the African American race, right? I
Mhm,
remember one study too that looked at siblings because
mhm,
people always want to play quote unquote devil's advocate and say, oh well,
mhm,
maybe it's the family upbringing or maybe it's the
mhm,
socioeconomic status. They
mhm,
look at siblings,
mhm,
same household, same parenting style,
mhm,
and the lighter skinned sibling earned more years of schooling than the darker skinned sibling
mhm.
or
Yes.
Hispanic and Asian Americans, right?
Mhm,
And so
mhm,
when we look at variables being held constant, such as socioeconomic status and parenting, we still see the same outcomes.
it
And that,
is. Mhm.
yeah,
Yes,
and that,
it's global. It's definitely global,
mhm,
and it's not isolated to the United States. It is, you hear it in a lot of different non-white communities that, skin color, it is a factor between
mhm,
cousins, between siblings,
yeah.
who is worthy of education, right? Um,
Ooh, yes,
is
that part.
who has the who can get married, right?
Mhm, mhm,
Who should be the one to make them more money or enter in different professions. So it's definitely prevalent, and it's not isolated to a conversation in the United States. It's a
right.
global issue. And
Mhm.
so I think when people start hearing that, then they'll say, oh, unfortunately, sometimes you have to say it for it to get any legs. Like, this is not just
Yeah,
Black people in the United
exactly.
States complaining, right?
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is a global phenomenon, and
Mhm.
let's get some receipts of some other people so you
Mhm.
can take this seriously, right?
Yeah.
And so the problem with it in education is so we are used to looking at or disaggregating our data based on race, right?
Yep. Exactly.
You're not going to find too many
Talk to us.
I wouldn't even say I'm not sure how many like are going to disaggregate it based on skin tone
Exactly.
stratification, right? In that
Yep.
range, just doesn't you don't see that. And
Nope.
so when you start to bring up this topic of colorism, they're like, wait, what? Now we're already what's this thing? Like we're talking about equity, right? But
Mhm.
in racism, we're giving y'all that. So now y'all want us to talk about skin color within
Right.
that too? Like this is way too much, right?
Yep.
This is way too much for my zone of you know.
Yep.
So it's so interesting how you have to really break it down and explain it. And how I explain it a lot of times is this. I know we're totally off topic now.
No,
You
keep going. Keep going.
probably don't know what the last question was now. And so I say, it within a the Eurocentricism, what do you all honor as beautiful, right? Historically, what do y'all blonde hair, blue eye, right? So with that blonde hair, blue eye, their assignments. Oh, that person's beautiful, right? I want to hire that person because they're marketable or they can get more clients or whatever. They're smart, right? And they're so approachable and nice. So there's those assignments, right? So when you think about that as the standard, then it's almost like so the more you stray away from that standard,
Yep.
the more negative attributes are assigned to that. And
Exactly.
we see that in the police force, right? In not police force, but in the police violence again
Mhm.
against darker skinned men. We see that,
Yep.
men are tricky because in some ways the dark virile man, is sexy, right? But in other ways he's a threat and he's dangerous, right?
Exactly. Yep.
So they're a little different. So women, however, um, rarely get that assignment of
Mhm.
beautiful like men do. So they get that a little bit of that, right? But it also could kill them in the streets because
Exactly.
of people think they're a threat, right? And
Exactly.
so with women though, we learn this early, and we just don't learn it inside our homes. It continues to be reinforced outside the home by,
Mhm.
again, the society, by our peers, by our media, and our interactions in school. And
Yes.
so that's what's so detrimental. Well, with the whole push for social emotional learning in schools right now, we have to be able to address what our students are going through
Mhm.
with and the trauma that they are being um, impacted by with colorism. And so, but it's
Absolutely.
not mentioned a lot.
That's right. There's a really good comment here from Ava.
Mhm,
And in some ways, it's related to colorism education, even though it's dance education. But
mhm,
Ava says, this conversation reminds me of being in the ballet from 10 to 31 years old. No one
mhm,
in suburban Illinois had ever seen a darker skinned principal dancer dancing the roles of Clara, Giselle, or Odette from those famous ballets. And
mhm,
oftentimes, it would invariably be a lighter skinned dancers who were chosen for those parts so as to not, quote, break the tradition, no
mhm,
matter the talent or a dancer's capacity. And I also think about Zora Neale Hurston's quote in her memoir, Dust Stripes on the Road, when she
mhm,
brings up the ways that lighter skinned African Americans were favored. And so one of the things
mhm,
she said was that the lighter skinned kids were always chosen to play the princess or the fairy in the school play.
mhm,
And so
mhm,
even beyond academics, when we look at extracurricular activities, even when we look at sports, right? And like just who's chosen as like class president or who's chosen for internships or
mhm,
who do the guidance counselors want to allow to shadow them or to like work in the office and like all of these other things outside of just strict academics where
mhm,
colorism might give some students greater access to opportunities and learning and
mhm,
even scholarships, right? That other dark skinned students don't get. And so in the
mhm,
world of dance, where a lot of these decisions, and this brings me to a follow-up question I want to ask you. A lot of these decisions are like white choreographers or white directors
Mm-hmm.
choosing
Mm-hmm.
and casting people, and they tend to cast or choose the lighter skinned people of color. And so we
Mm-hmm.
know that in the world of education,
Mm-hmm.
just at large in this country, most teachers and administrators nationally are white.
Mm-hmm.
And so what do you say to people who say, "Oh, well, to white folks, they just see us all as black and they don't make any differences." Cuz my theory and the way I
Mm-hmm.
think of it is that if most school teachers are white and we look at all these inequalities in the school system based on colorism,
Mm-hmm.
and some of that has to be coming from the preferences that white teachers have in favor of lighter skinned children of color. But I'm curious to know what you think about that. Like, does the race of the teacher or the administrator or the dean play
Mm-hmm.
a factor, and to what degree?
No, I think it happens interculturally and intraculturally. It's both, right? And
Mhm,
so I think that what it is I don't think a lot of this stuff is implicitly like
mhm,
it's not even in their zone of understanding sometimes.
right.
I think as people of color, we are accustomed to understanding this conversation, right? So it might not be a conversation we want to have, but it's a conversation we heard, right? And
Mhm,
so, but with people who have not had to um, understand or even think about this problem, it's a lot of subliminal things that occur. It's implicit until you it's implicit until you bring it to their attention, right? And
mhm.
so it's all these things that they might not even be aware that they're doing,
Yeah.
or comments they might say,
Mhm,
that you have to, bring to their attention. It's so deeply embedded into the psyche in our mental models
mhm,
that some people don't understand the way they're thinking. It's that whole cognition. It's like you have to have colorism cognition, right? You have to think about the way you're thinking, right? And
right.
so, right? And so it's it's calling it out when you see it and questioning those statements, or questioning the why behind it, right? And so if you're an administrator or something and you see that your teacher, no matter what race or ethnicity they are, we need to be able to see that what's going on in our classrooms, right? In your schools, and what are the things being said about certain students compared to what's not being said about other students, and they're doing the same thing in your classroom. We know that when people are, I'm going to take it to the classroom, when teachers think a child is going to be more problematic, right? That their eyes track them more, right?
Oof.
I'm tracking the student, and we already said what those assignments are, right? If I'm tracking the student I think is going to be the problem, then I'm going to catch that student, right? More so than I'm going to catch the student that I don't think is a problem, right? Because I'm watching that child.
Yes, I got goosebumps. I got goosebumps. I Can I share some personal anecdotes? Well,
Yes, please
there's
do.
one anecdote I always like to share because I think it's a classic case. When I was teaching high school, predominantly Black Title I
Mm-hmm.
school, there were fraternal twins, two
Mm-hmm.
teenage boys who were fraternal twins. So again, same household dynamic, same upbringing, and
Mm-hmm.
yet the lighter skinned sibling, who wasn't technically light skinned, but they were just lighter than the other
Mm-hmm.
sibling, the other twin, was in honors classes, star athlete, one of the teacher's favorites. The
Mm-hmm.
darker brother, who had broader features and a kinkier curl pattern,
Mm-hmm.
special education courses, remedial courses,
Mm-hmm.
seen as, getting into trouble more, seen as like a more of a behavior problem, and just
Mm-hmm.
not a beloved student in the way that their
Mm-hmm.
brother was. And so I even think about self-fulfilling prophecies and how even sometimes parents, you know, can play into that too. And it has a compounding effect over the course of
Right.
someone's life. And that's what's so detrimental about these
Mm-hmm.
things happening in school, because they're happening at the earliest of ages, how you might track a student into a lower performing
Mm-hmm.
um, grade very early on, and it's hard to recover from that because the biases continue, the discrimination continues.
Right.
But I also remember being of like 5 years old when I was in elementary school. A white classmate of mine called me the N-word, and I hit her. So, you know, I hit her. I did. And then when we got in trouble, the two teachers were talking to each other. And so there, of course, my name is Sarah. So there's always at least two Sarahs in every class. And so one white teacher said to the other teacher, yeah, you know, Ashley and Sarah got into a fight. And the other white teacher was like, oh, not Sarah. I can't believe Sarah did that, thinking the white Sarah. So the other teacher said, no, not that Sarah. That's Sarah. And the teacher went, oh, okay. Now, mind you, I never had gotten into any fights. I had never gotten in trouble for hitting, for any type. I might have been running my mouth a little bit, but never ever had a reputation like, and not since then ever got into physical fights. But the way the teacher just all of a sudden it made sense to her, right? That it's the Black Sarah, and particularly a darker skinned Black Sarah, she was the one who got into the fight.
Yeah, it's understandable now, right?
Yeah, right. It's not as shocking.
Oh, well, you know, that's what she's supposed to be doing. You know, that's kind of like, oh, I get, yeah, you know, that doesn't surprise me. Look at her, you know, that kind of thing, right?
Exactly.
And so that brings me to this. If you're always being thought of that way,
come on.
What does it do to you, right? So you grow up thinking, I'm bad. I'm not as good as my sibling, right? I'm not as smart. That stereotype threat plays out, right?
Yes.
And so when so basically a child is performing the way you think
exactly
they're supposed to, right? So and so it's stereotype threat in that whole arena of colorism that we don't talk about a lot, right? We talk about stereotype threat and other things, but about race, right? Okay. But when we talk about that with colorism, if a child has been getting these messages that they're not worthy as someone else, right? That they're not as smart as someone else, right? As they are not as of anything, like, you know, approachable or whatever, then many students will live up to that expectation, which is a very low expectation, right?
Exactly. Yes.
And so that halo and horn effect is crucial, right? So if I'm a teacher and I am assigning these positive attributes to the student, and so they can do no wrong, right? Then that child is going to come in with some, you know, unfortunately, we respond to the way or the adults in the building treat us, right? So I am going to come in with higher self-esteem. I can come in the classroom and I'm smart, right? I'm going to be nice. It's that halo effect, right? Because everything that teacher thinks about me, I can do no wrong. Even though I might be sneaky, I might be cheating or whatever, but because of that halo effect, they're not going to think that way about that child. And that child responds accordingly, right? But then the horn effect is the opposite. And that's what we often get with our students who have been impacted by colorism in the classroom. It's the horn effect. Because I don't think that you are beautiful, that I don't think you're smart, I'm not going to spend any time with you in the classroom to get you where you should be, right? I'm going to think that anytime there's a problem, it's your fault. And then then the stereotype threat comes in, right? So I'm not going to perform for you in the classroom because you don't think I'm smart. Why?
Exactly.
I'm not going to be friendly to you because you already think I'm mean, right?
I'm not going to pay attention. I'm not going to worry about engaging in the assignments. Why bother?
Right.
Why bother?
So it's this, and then they wonder why. Well, why is he acting like this, or why is she acting like this? So so people don't take the time, educators don't take the time to think about what are we as adults doing.
Yes.
And if a child has been dealing with this, and it's in from a infant, really, to a toddler, through
Exactly.
through the
Preschool.
formative years. Those formative years when you're developing your perception of self are crucial. They're crucial for any child, but crucial for an African American child, right? And
Yeah.
so you're always hearing negative things about you, always feeling like there's something not, you're not enough. Then how do you perform, right? So one thing I will say, Dr. Webb, is this: that the women in my study, they use that almost as their superpower, right? So they
Mm.
were like this, like, and I love this part because the research, when I researched, we, they, this angle was never brought up a lot, right? They were
Right.
a lot of, I don't feel like I'm worthy, so I'm not going to be attain an education past high school, or I might drop up, but because of this, right? But in my research, a lot of my women said, because people didn't think I was beautiful, and I didn't get attention for being beautiful, I was going to get attention for being smart. So a lot of them decided to flip the script and said, I'm going to be the most intelligent person in this classroom, right? The women in my participants in my study were, in law school, were master's degrees, bachelor's degree. That didn't stop them. And so they kind of use that as, their superpower. I called it intentional intelligence. And
Mm.
so I am intentionally going to put all this emphasis on being smart, because you don't see me as beautiful. And I see all these people getting attention for being beautiful, but I'm going to get attention for being smart.
Yes. So I have to say that that's my story too.
Was
I
it?
leaned into everything, all other attributes, right? Being
Mhm,
smart, but also being witty and being
mhm,
clever and creative and quirky. And it's like
mhm.
personality development.
Right.
Because again, I knew I wasn't going to get pretty points, right?
Mhm,
But it's interesting because as you were talking about the halo and the horn effect, I was thinking about how just like the moments of discrimination compound and snowball, for
mhm,
people,
mhm,
privilege also snowballs. And when I
mhm,
hear or see or observe light-skinned people find like denying their privilege, denying that light-skinned privilege is a thing, I'll
mhm,
use Kamala Harris, for example. I get a lot of pushback when I suggest that she
mhm,
might have benefited from being light-skinned. But someone said, well, how is it light-skinned privilege when, she was the only woman running or something like that, right? I was like, well,
mhm,
one, when she got selected for VP, she wasn't the only woman running. She wasn't the
mhm.
only Black woman running. But
Right.
just in trying to achieve the presidency, she was the only female candidate. And so someone was like, so
Mhm,
how can you say
mhm,
it's colorism? Because she wasn't
mhm,
going up against darker skinned people. And so I
mhm,
told them, I said, well, it's colorism because of all the moments in her life prior to getting on that stage that
mhm.
enabled her to get there in the first place.
Get there. Yep.
All of
Mhm,
the obstacles that were removed from her, all of the opportunities
mhm,
to say, "Oh, well, we'll let you do this internship. Oh, well,
mhm,
yes, you can lead the debate at the Model UN and high school."
mhm,
I don't know her life story, but that's an example of how allowing a certain child to help you pass out papers in kindergarten,
mhm, mhm,
and that being like, oh, allowing them to do the morning announcements and say the pledge on the intercom in the morning, and like all these
mhm.
opportunities to be a leader, all these
Right.
opportunities, you get to play the lead and you get to be team captain, all these
Mhm,
opportunities to develop your skills, you get to I don't know, like I said, job shadow me, or you get first
mhm,
dibs on an internship, all the opportunities that snowball for
mhm.
privilege as
Right.
well. So we can't just look at the moment when someone is 45 and they earn their spots at as
Mhm,
CEO of a company. Like, what
mhm.
have been all the opportunities that they were afforded that even got them in the door in the first place?
Absolutely, and that's important to realize is that at some point along the way, you were given your self-esteem was um, built up along the years, right? And
Mhm.
so, and it's because of how people have responded to you just by the way you look. And
Yeah.
so, and that isn't again, it's this consciousness and colorism that we have and understand that those are definitely issues that we have to unpack in
Mhm.
ourselves. And it's not just within our group, it's outside the group. It's
Yeah.
not external. I mean, it's external and internal. And so what we have to, it just doesn't stop between African Americans and Latinx community within themselves or Asian communities with themselves. It goes across these because believe me, if you feel that way about your own, you're definitely gonna feel that way
About yeah.
um, yeah, in your in another group, right? And so
Mhm.
even though a lot of people say, well, there's a minority, a teacher of color teaching in the classroom, it still happens,
It definitely still happens.
right?
Definitely.
Still happens.
Oh.
It's a whole other conversation, right? But it still happens.
Yes.
Cannot use that. Everybody. So I think that, and we have to start addressing this and studying this in our pre-service classroom, our teacher preparation classroom. We
100%.
have
Yes.
to. In our school psychologists, right? And our
Mhm.
counselors, our social workers,
Yeah.
right? Because this, all this emphasis is put on, trauma informed.
Yeah.
We have to bring in that trauma form, there's skin tone, there's colorism trauma, right? There's
Mhm.
all these things, there's all these layers, and there might be some other stuff going on, right? So,
Exactly.
so we have to be mindful. Teachers and educators, we do a lot of things. We have to be the nurse, we got to be the mom, we have to be everything. However, we bring in what from outside, the same understandings and the same mental models into the school. And that's why
Mm.
I always say schools are just microcosms of our society. We can't separate the two. What you believe outside that school is going to impact your students in the school,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Yep.
And so,
So
go ahead.
I kind of I don't want to take us too long. I try to wrap it
Mhm,
up around the 45-minute mark.
mhm,
So what you've already started going there, right? With
okay,
like rethinking how we train pre-service
mhm,
teachers. But just off the top of the dome, not
mhm.
off the top of the dome, because again, this is your research and you have like 25 years of experience. But what are some initial steps that people can take, whether they're a parent in a school system or a counselor? Just what would be your takeaway for the audience in terms of starting to address this and knowing that it could take time and that it takes many moving parts? But what would you say to anyone who might be listening as to how we can start to address and rectify colorism in schools?
Now, Dr. Webb, you know doggone well that I can't answer that in a simple manner. This is too much of a complicated
Mm,
and intertwined endemic problem,
pandemic.
right?
Well,
And
well,
so I would
tackle it however you see fit.
agree. Okay, so we got to hit this on the macro level
Yes.
in school systems district wide, looking at our policies, right?
Yeah.
Looking at who we hire, right? We got
Mm,
to interrogate our curriculum,
mm.
right? Look for representation when we hire, when we're picking superintendents. Like, are we picking one of the other because of colorist ideologies or mindsets or mental models, things like that, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Then that's a quick one, just that top of that macro, right? The meso level is the school leaders, right? How are we looking at our discipline policies, right? Or how are we looking at our classrooms? Like, are we having colorism critical classrooms?
Mm.
So what I say that is, when I go into a class, do we have representation, right? how are we consciously looking at what's going on in our classrooms? Are we being critical of it? Not just about um, who's giving the opportunities based on race, but who's given the
Mhm.
opportunities based on skin tone
Right.
and right. Um, our colorism audits. So we're auditing just how we have our equity audits in the schools. Why can't we have a colorism audit right in our school,
Mhm.
right? And so that's a
Mhm.
whole other thing in the whole equity world. I believe that if we have equity policy, there has to be a colorism policy embedded in it, right?
Yep.
So if you're there, I just don't think I don't think our colorism policy can sit by itself. It has to
Mhm.
be
Right.
embedded within
Yes.
our culturally responsive pedagogy, our culturally relevant pedagogy, our culturally responsive teaching, right? This
Yes.
has to be embedded in all that ways we approach
Mhm.
our students, right? And then you can't have the macro and meso without having that micro. And that micro is what's happening right there in your classroom. How are you checking yourself? When that student comes in your classroom
Mm.
with the darker skin and the kinkier hair, what is your first thoughts about that student? Because your first thoughts, if you don't check those mental models and those biases, that child is going to feel, right? And we're instantly impacting that child by the way we think about them. Children are smart, right? They know one of the most important things with a student is that that interaction with the adults in the building, right? And so if we instantly think negative things about a child because of their attributes, right? Their assignment of those of the phenotypes that we give them,
Mhm.
then they're going to feel it, right? And so, how do we feel? So, checking that. So, you're checking that, and not only checking what you're thinking and how you're treating your students, you have to check what's going on between your students. That peer-to-peer relationship in your classroom, you just can't let children slide with saying
Come
derogatory
on.
statements to each other, right?
Mm.
How
Mm.
do you how there's harm there, right? So how
Yep.
do you respond to that harm when it happens in your classroom?
Mhm.
But you have to be conscious about it. Consciousness and colorism has to happen before you can even start to think about how I check this in my own psyche. So I'll leave you with that. Those three levels, that macro, that meso, and that micro, it has to be done. I feel like it's a sandwich approach, right? You're hitting it from the policies, but you're also hitting it in that self
Yeah.
site system. System, site, self as well. A lot of people say it that way.
Hey. Oh, oh, I like the alliteration.
Right, right.
Oh my goodness. That's a very powerful way to end. And I think that's a great thing to leave people with. But before we wrap up, are you open to people like learning more, reaching out if they want,
Absolutely.
to consult or
Oh
anything?
yeah, most definitely.
How
Yes,
would you, how
yes.
would you prefer them to reach out to you or keep in
You can
touch?
reach out to me on LinkedIn. It's I think I'm Shannon Holder Anderson
Yeah.
on LinkedIn, and on Instagram I'm Colorism Edu. I had to remember if I had a U on the end. Yes, I'm Colorism Edu on Instagram and Shannon Holder Anderson on LinkedIn. Yeah, so you
Yeah.
can reach me either way. I'll be happy to talk to you. Yeah, consulting, whatever, let's make this happen. And let's dismantle this colorism in schools.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today, whether you joined live or you're watching the recording on LinkedIn or later on YouTube. And thank you for everyone who engaged in the chat, who were tuning in live. I really appreciate your comments and just your presence here today. So I'll be back for part 3 in this 6-part series with Akosawa Lesesne and talking about colorism in hiring and employment.
Mhm.
So let's say students successfully get out of school and they enter the workforce.
Mhm.
Are they being hired equitably? And are they facing colorism and discrimination just in their quest to gain employment and to start their careers? So that's coming up next week, Thursday, February 24th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, so 1 hour earlier. And yeah, but in the meantime, leave a comment if you're watching the playback. Let us know what you think, and be sure to go and follow Shannon Holder Anderson on LinkedIn and Colorism EDU on Instagram. And I look forward to seeing y'all next week. Bye.
Okay.